There's an epidemic of thoughtlessness at the moment, and the opposite is being thoughtful. But being thoughtful is being attentive. We really need to have a concept of nature. We need to have a concept of culture, but not in the way they were understood by modern thought. It's obvious that reindeer, for example, they're doing a lot of stuff with reindeer, and if you're working out with Sami people, you get reindeer on the brain, so to speak. You live and you think reindeer. They're like that, and you realize that these reindeer are intelligent animals. They have memories. They have quite complicated systems of social relations. They know the landscape like the back of their hand. They can find their way about. And they also have devious ways of trying to manage to live alongside human beings who are also equally devious. And each is learning from the other. The point is that both nature and culture are very old words. And nature comes from Latin nascere, meaning to be born, culture from colere, meaning to cultivate. And I think we should go back to nature in its original sense that you find, for example, in Lucretius, De Rerum Naturae, a power distributed throughout the cosmos to give birth to new life. That's very Bergsonian. And culture, meaning the task, the human task of looking after this newborn life so that it can flourish. That there's a potential at large in the world to give birth to life. And they all have this idea that human beings have a responsibility to look after it. I struck gold with this lines thing because it just seemed to be inexhaustible. Lines, and so it all started from there, in a way, that particular question. But it took root, I think, because I think there are three things. One is going back to my dad and the mycology. In fungi are very linear in that way. The fungal mycelium is a mesh of lines. So that's one thing. The second thing is, again, my experience of doing fieldwork with Sami people, where one of the most remarkable things is that everybody has their own footpath. It's a footpath connecting their winter dwelling to their summer place where they fish. So everybody has their own particular footpath. People may use it, but they'll recognize it as so-and-so's footpath. And so it's fairly well established in Sami thinking that people are their paths, people are their footpaths. And when you yoik a person, you travel their path. It's very obvious in a way. Then the third thing was playing the cello, which has affected, I think, the way I think and the way I write in all sorts of ways. And I've been playing the cello since I was 12. So I think these three things together had something to do with it. It's a very gestural instrument. I mean, you learn a piece of music gesturally rather than as a sequence of notes. And you have the feeling when you play that you're pulling this line out of the instrument. It's like it's pulling treacle out of a jar. You sort of drag it out, and that's just the way it is. I'm a bit tired, although I've used it a lot, and now I wish I hadn't. I'm a bit fed up with the concept of embodiment. It's a very specific reason, and the same reason why I'm a bit fed up with agency. It's obvious, for example, that playing a cello is a bodily activity. That's obvious, goes without saying. But to say that it's embodied is another matter altogether. And what I'm bothered about is the extent to which people confuse bodily with embodied. And the thing is that the M of embodiment implies a sort of wrapping up, a sinking. It's as though the body was a sink. The skill sinks into it. And I think that's wrong. I mean, for example, if you said that breathing was embodied, you would suffocate. I don't think that digital technology is the future. I don't think it's going to last more than another century at most. And I think, therefore, we have to take care of the skills that humans have found useful for even tens of thousands of years and make sure that they're there for generations to come. And it seems to me sort of fairly obvious, but to try and get that across to people is really hard and just seems to get harder by the day.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. How Shall We Live? That's the beginning of a book called Anthropology, Why It Matters, from this week's guest, Tim Ingold. Tim is the Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. He's a fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and he's one of the most influential anthropologists working today. And he's one of the writers people have most suggested that I should read because we have a lot of themes in common. He's often considered a philosopher as well because he does address these big issues, and his whole approach to anthropology is rather philosophical, as you'll hear unfold a bit today, although he's also written very directly about that. He's written many books. One is called Making, one is called Lines, Lines. There's another called Perception of the Environment. There's many more, but as you can probably tell just from those, it's very intriguing for me, for someone who's thinking about reimagining what we mean by mind and movement. There are two main ideas to this conversation. The first one really is this idea of how shall we live, which is obviously a very important question right now, and a question that's at the heart of Tim's work. He's constantly thinking about that question. And the other idea is that of the line, of what I might call a string of affordances or the way we make. And I just want to read the first sentence of Tim's book called Lines, because I think it expresses something about this idea and this conversation. So here it is. What do walking, weaving, observing, singing, storytelling, drawing, and writing have in common? The answer is that they all proceed along lines of one kind or another. So that's the beginning of the book. I highly suggest you read it. It's very fascinating. And you've probably heard me talk about this before, of this line that we're tracing as our life from the moment we're born to the moment we die. There's an unbroken line that is us in the world, and it's many, many layers. It's all the books we read and the conversations we have, all the steps we take. Everything is part of our line. And we can look at other lines too. Our family has a sort of line, our society, our nation. So we are paths, and our lives extend paths as we go. They carry the lines on from others. We make lines for those who will come. Just think of all the books that you've read. Those are lines that people made for you, that you picked up and extended in your own way. So then comes the question, what lines are we making together now? What lines are we extending and continuing each day with our choices, with our words, with the ways we treat one another, with the habits we form, and what we read and what we create, and the paths we build? Do we know where those lines are coming from? And do we know where they're heading? If we imagine life as lived along lines, we are making our humanity as we go along. That's Tim's idea. That's a primary idea in his work and in this conversation. He's a scholar who brought forward many of the ideas or the lines that we now take for granted. I did not know Tim Ingold's work when I first came up with this notion of waymaking, which is itself a word that comes from Taoism. But that is an idea of the way we move through the world being our mind and our path and our life, in a similar way to what Tim is saying, although also very different. So I have to say that he's been a very big influence on me now that I have read him over this past year. It's been almost an emotional experience to read some of his work because it does resonate so much and it adds a lot, and I want to publicly say thank you here. He's a wonderful writer. He really cares about the writing. He cares about what he's giving to the world. And as we talk about here, if we're going to have a world where love remains possible, then it's going to be because we made and extended that line, and because we chose to be responsible for one another, and because we thought the world was worth it. In this conversation, Tim brings up this quote from Hannah Arendt, which is exactly that. She says that education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it. And that word education and what she means by it becomes especially potent, I think, if we consider it in terms of the lines we are following and extending right now when it comes to information and what we understand as knowledge, what we provide and acknowledge as knowledge in these times. So what lines are we extending, and why does it matter? It matters because love is possible and we can make more of it together. I mean, just think about that we actually can do that. We can make meaning and we can make love together. That's what we do. But we have to choose to do it. We have to choose those lines. We have to choose to hold those lines. We have to choose to realize meaning and love are made as much as they are given. It is both, but it is a choice. It is a responsibility. As Tim says, knowledge is forged along the way of life. It's up to us. And as you'll hear here, he had a lot of radical ideas back in his youth and opened up a lot of dichotomies. And he's still questioning those, even going back and questioning his own ideas from back then. He's constantly questioning, even sometimes a bit grumpy, as he says, but always with real kindness and with awareness, a constant practice of being aware of attention, of bringing something into attention and questioning it as a sign of respect, and also, I think, as a choice of love. So it does matter what we're extending out of ourselves and what we're picking up to extend. It matters in every conversation we have and everything we do, even with people we may never see again. All of that is extending little lines and making things possible. And the same for us. People are doing that for us all the time. Tim's done that. He likes to call himself a lineologist, which is kind of funny. But I guess we're all lineologists in a way if we start to look at our lives and trace where the ideas and feelings and thoughts and actions have come from and where we want them to go, which seems like a good idea right now. As you'll hear with Tim, it started with the mycelium. Then he learned a lot from the Sami people in Finland about paths. And then, of course, Gibson, Bergson, Whitehead, so many others. It's interesting to put our attention on those lines and notice those lines and continue them. A lot of this conversation is the story of how Tim came to think differently and how he came into a practice of caring for thought. And it's a demonstration of his thinking process, actually. And you can see how he's constantly turning things over and scrutinizing certain words and what they really mean. And as I said, I really see that as a sign of respect and love for life itself and for the mystery of it, for the beauty of it, for being responsible for it. So thanks for being here. Thanks for your support. I hope you're doing well wherever you are in the world. And I wish you very beautiful lines today.
Okay.
Hello, Tim.
Hello,
Tim. Wonderful to see you. I'm so happy that you're here today. Thank you for doing this.
It's a pleasure.
There's so much I want to talk to you about that I don't know how I'll get to it all, but I thought I'd start with asking about walking, your early memories of walking, if you might have any. What comes to mind, maybe early childhood or, I don't know, youth of walking?
Well, my earliest memories are going for walks with mostly my father. My father was a mycologist and loved to walk in the woods and fields around where we lived, which was in the South Downs in the county of Kent, south of London. So he would go looking for fungi, and so I would go walking with him, and he was a great walker, and my elder sisters would sometimes be along too. And then later on, I would be walking on my own. I was very interested I was a model maker when I was small. I love making models of things. So I would observe buildings and photograph. Well, I was eventually given a Kodak camera and I could photograph them and then draw them and make models of them and do that kind of thing. That was by the time I was more like 10, 11, 12.
I was going to ask you about that, if you were already drawing by chance, making lines.
Well, I kind of was not very well. I'm not an artist, and I don't really have drawing in my blood, but I suppose I was to some extent. But I did love miniature things, making models of things. I really liked the idea that you could make a model of buildings or a village or a railway station and then set your eyes at the level of the baseboard and imagine sort of look into it. I like doing that.
Yeah, it's a change of perspective.
It's a long time ago now, but we were
Yes.
always walking a lot. And of course, we didn't have a car or anything like that back then, so one had to walk. Going to school, I would have to, like when I went to school as a child, I would have to walk about a mile along a footpath that adjoined a road and then to the station, then take a train. It's about 10 minutes, and then a little bit of walk the other end, not so far.
So you were very immersed in your environment from the beginning without thinking about it. It's just
without thinking about it, yes. Yeah, I think so.
But your father was a scientist?
Yes, he was a botanist, and his special field was mycology. And within mycology, he was particularly interested in certain kinds of microscopic fungi that live in streams, in rivers. Was his that was his specialism.
Of course, now everyone's talking about that, but
Yes.
I suppose it wasn't quite like that back then.
No, it wasn't. And I always tried to explain to him when he was couldn't quite understand what this anthropology was that I was doing, that anthropology is to the social sciences what mycology is to the biosciences, because fungi don't behave as organisms are supposed to behave. And in the classical view, an organism is a nice self-contained being with a body and an inside and an outside, and it interacts with its environment. But fungi just aren't like that. They don't have a clear inside and an outside, and they're fluid, and what you see are the fruiting bodies, but the real fungus is spreading around all under the ground. And so I tried to explain to him that in anthropology, that's how we think about people too. We don't think about them as sort of bounded entities. We think of them as these ever extending pathways of relationships that go through the world. So I think um, maybe I felt myself as a kind of mycologist in the social sciences.
Even anthropology itself, I was wondering if you perhaps made it into, in some way, maybe not consciously, a way of exploring or connecting other so-called disciplines as well, in a similar sense to what you just explained.
I first went into anthropology after doing a year of natural sciences at university, because um, I was looking for something that would transcend the divisions between the humanities and the natural sciences in a way that still stayed somehow close to people's experience. And anthropology seemed to be the one subject that could do that. I mean, philosophy was also trying to overcome that boundary, which and in a naive kind of way, I already sort of felt that there was something very wrong about this division between the humanities and the natural sciences, that it was some kind of intellectual disaster and needed to be resolved. And um, so I was looking for something that would transcend it. Um, yeah, um, and anthropology was. I thought that anthropology is, and I still think that anthropology is at a kind of crossroads between two oppositions. One is between the natural sciences and the humanities, and the other is between life as it is, as it life as it could be, or speculations about what life might be like, and what life actually is like for people at particular places and particular times. And if you think of those two like two axes, well, where those two axes cross, that's for me where anthropology is.
Yeah, we could almost think of it multidimensional too, because you've touched a lot of lives by this point in art, in architecture, in design, in anthropology, in archaeology, in cognitive science, in philosophy. It's not even just one intersection of two roads. It kind of depends where you're coming from, huh?
Yes, I mean, now my problem is that I'm all over the place, and it's quite to pin myself down. That has its advantages and disadvantages. It's great actually to be all over the place, but from time to time it's a bit difficult to find an anchor.
It's a lot to
So
hold.
yes.
I wonder, you said you were already interested in these questions, that you felt something was wrong with this division of humanities and science, or that even the division of mind and body in a way that you kind of set up. But was this before you had done your your early field work when you went to Lapland and you wrote your PhD, which I think
It's
became your first?
long before. I mean,
Okay, so you already
this is
had
the
that.
point where I'm trying to decide what subject to study. And I've done a year of natural sciences because I would, without really thinking about it, I'd done science at school and done well in it, and it was just assumed that that's what I would do. And after a year of science in Cambridge, I decided I wasn't against science, but I just couldn't imagine myself as a scientist. So I was looking around for something else. So at that point, I hadn't even begun studying anthropology, so I really didn't know exactly what to expect, but it looked promising.
So that's interesting because were you considering you were going to learn about them, to use that kind of terminology? Were you thinking you were going to be observing and watching, and
To
that
do
this
field
is sort
work
of,
when I went
separate?
when I went to do field work with the Sami, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Um, I think that at that point, I wasn't really thinking in these sort of big, grandiose terms at all. I mean, the first thing that happens when you go to do field work is that you go in, maybe you start with your head full of all kind of grand theories, but very soon you forget them all, and you're really completely immersed in just day-to-day things, that just the sort of things that affect people in their everyday life, and so you completely forget about all these big issues and simply get stuck into that. I've been drawn to work in the north, which at that time was rather unusual in British anthropology. Most of my colleagues, my peers, were going to work in former British colonies, and that's what you did in those days, the early 1970s. You go to work in Africa or South or Southeast Asia or somewhere which was a former colonial country, and there was no tradition then of going to work in a place like Sapmi, and but I mean, the story is that I had a Finnish girlfriend who's now my wife of 50 plus years, and um, so when I announced to my professor, Maya Fortis, that I wanted to do fieldwork in Lapland, and the main reason was that she was studying in the south of Finland at the time, and so she could join me during university vacations when we were in the field. I wanted to be in the same country at least as she was. Uh, and Maya Fortis said his first comment was, "I suppose you have a sleeping dictionary." It's not a particularly nice thing to say, but I only was told much later on that this was a term used by colonial administrators to refer to their native concubines. So there you go. I mean,
Oh my goodness.
attitude. That was the attitude of the time. But I was also sort of just got very hooked on the north, on the far north. I just sort of I was just kind of hooked on it, and so I want that. That's what I wanted to do, and that's what drew me there, rather than any kind of big issues of.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is what I don't quite understand, or I want to try to set up, because it's changed so much since that moment in time for you. Is this what you were talking about in your first book? It seems like you were trying to reconcile something environmental with something personal or internal. I think you talk about it in terms of person and organism sometimes. I guess I know at the time you weren't thinking in those terms, but I wonder if you can remember waking up or coming into a different understanding of that. I know you wrote that first book sort of structured in a certain way, so I'm trying to understand where you were and how that was changing for you in those early years.
Well, yes, my very first book was simply an ethnography of the Sami I'd worked with, and I wrote it in a pretty conventional way, and it's not very good. I'm not particularly satisfied with it, but and I did feel when I was writing it that somehow what the real sense of what it meant to live there amongst those people had gone through the cracks. It's like going through a sieve. What I'd retained was a whole lot of rather boring, very factual stuff about how people were making a living, about household economics, about politics, and so on. But somehow the meaning of life for Sami people had somehow fallen through, and so I was trying to recover what that was, and um, and now if I look back, I think that and ask myself, why I got interested in particular ways of looking at the world. Say why it was that when I picked up Bergson's Creative Evolution, it blew my mind and said, this is everything I've been trying to say, or why it is I got into lines and all these things. Actually, part of it lies in that early experience of fieldwork, but it took 10, 20 years for it to kind of filter through. me to get a handle on what it actually was. Because at the time you're still growing up. I mean, it's only what, 20, 24. I mean, you're still growing up and learning about life and finding out who you are. So it took a long time for that to show through. And I started off with a fairly conventional understanding. I was thinking, well, particularly in my teaching, I got my first job in Manchester, and I was teaching a course on ecological anthropology, which was a fairly new field in those days for British anthropology. And I started off from the premise, which seemed obvious, that every human being participates in two systems: a system of ecological relations. They're an organism. They have to feed, they eat to live, and so on. But also they're a person. They're involved in a system of ecological relations, and they're involved in a system of social relations. On the one hand, as an organism, on the other, as a person. And the problem for anthropology is to try and understand how those two systems relate to one another, the interplay between them. And I carried on along with that for quite a while. And again, in my teaching, every year I teach it, I felt that there's something really wrong with this. And it went on until 1988. And I remember finding my notes from a lecture course. I'd written out all my lectures, and I'd said, well, every human being is a participant in two systems of relations, ecological and social, but of course it's more complicated than that, and my notes fizzled out. I couldn't go on because I realized it didn't work. So that was in 1988, and I figured I'd have to start all over again.
What was that block there for people? Because this is a kind of a general audience, and I mean, maybe it even relates to what you were saying about the actual experience of being in the community of the Sami, and that wasn't coming through either. And also that your very early inclinations that there was something wrong with this dividing going on between something like humanities and science. What was that? Can you help me understand why didn't it work? Why did it fizzle out? What do you think?
Concerned, it's obvious that reindeer, for example, they're doing a lot of stuff with reindeer, and if you're working out with Sami people, you get reindeer on the brain, so to speak. You live and you think reindeer. They're like that, and you realize that these reindeer are intelligent animals. They have memories. They have quite complicated systems of social relations. They know the landscape like the back of their hand. They can find their way about. And they also have devious ways of trying to manage to live alongside human beings who are also equally devious, and each is learning from the other. And so far as the Sami are concerned, it would never occur to them to think that humans are somehow living on a different plane, on a different level. That's a function of our Enlightenment thinking, putting all the emphasis on the intellect or something like that as some distinguishing mark of humanity. But for Sami, that the intellect as some kind of reasoning capacity, that's not terribly important. What's important is an ability to notice things, to respond appropriately to whatever's going on around you. And so far as they could tell, people need to do that. Reindeer are doing that too. So it would never occur to them to put these on a different plane. So I think I was thinking already then that you can't put the humans and the non-humans in different worlds. One of my very first published articles in 1974 was called On Reindeer and Men, in which I started from the proposition that actually reindeer are intelligent decision-making animals that are making decisions, among other things, about what to do with humans, just as humans are making decisions about what to do with reindeer, and that you have to understand the herding situation as a kind of a dialogue between the two. And it was completely rubbished. I did get published, but people are saying this is completely ridiculous. I mean, reindeer making decisions. I mean, what are you talking about? So, and now, of course, that's all fashionable. And people have all discovered these non-humans, which I was talking. So I sometimes feel a bit grumpy because I was actually talking about that back in the 1970s.
Yeah, I can understand that. You might feel grumpy about a lot of things because when one looks back at your work, there's a lot of things that you were doing a long time ago that are now becoming normal. But in that same note too, even that title of Reindeer and Men reminds me of Tolman and Cognitive Maps and Rats and Men or something. It's a similar theme, and it makes me want to know what your experience with animals was before you went there, and if you had your own sort of experience of realizing the directness of knowledge in that sense. That's why I said, did you go there to learn about? Because in your work later, you talk about the difference between about and with or from in terms of thinking of anthropology as educational.
I mean, when I originally went to the field, I thought that I was going to be interested in Sami ethnopolitics. I was working with a minority group among the Sami, a rather stigmatized minority actually within the Sami people themselves. So they were a bit stigmatized by other Sami who considered them a bit sort of not real people. And so I was interested in the politics of all of that. And I very soon discovered that nobody else was really very interested in that. What they were really interested in was all these issues about reindeer. So I sort of put the politics rather to one side and got on with other things. But living in that kind of environment, you have to develop a certain kind of a sensibility. It's a sort of atmosphere that you breathe. And people talk about Sami culture as though culture was some kind of thing, but it's not really a thing. It's an atmosphere. It's very hard to put your finger on exactly what it is. But when I try to think how I've got interested in this or that theme, it often comes out of living and breathing that particular atmosphere.
I guess you started living and breathing that too. It's almost an example of this. I was in Mongolia for the Peace Corps, and there's reindeer herders there too, and I have a little sense of what you mean. And it does relate to a lot of things you've written about in terms of thinking of movement through the line itself that you're living and the embodied interaction. I guess you were learning that physically, that
Yeah, I guess so.
what
Yeah.
you would later try to
I
understand
mean,
in your
it would be
writings.
difficult. You couldn't live there and not be affected by these kinds of things. It would be impossible. So yes, but it took me a long, long time before I realized what I had really learned, or or at least before I could put it into any kind of words or explain it to anybody else what it was. It starts off just being part of who you are and the way you look on things, but it's not something you can easily articulate. Whereas it's easy to write about to write a chapter about techniques of reindeer herding or about local kinship or about how people are managing their household economies. You can write about that in a fairly matter-of-fact sort of way. But this other stuff is very hard to get a handle on.
Which is the real stuff, as you were saying. It's kind
Yeah,
of
well, that's
what
the real.
feels. So how did you? Because you've brought that in, but so that moment where you realized you were writing the text and it sort of fizzled out because it seems like you had these two things you were trying to put together as if they were separate, and you had to think of it in a different way. Is this around the time when you started to read Hallowell and Gibson and those sort of writers? Or?
It was 1988. I remember quite distinctly, and I had read Gibson around about 85, 86, but also Bergson, Whitehead, a lot of these people, because I was writing this book. It's called Evolution and Social Life. Nobody ever reads it, but I was writing it, which was going to be this great magnum opus about the history of thinking about evolution in biology, anthropology, and history. It was all about the difference between history and evolution. It's a huge book. And for that, I did a lot of reading in the philosophical literature. Um, and people who looked at this said that I'd left psychology out, and that's when they said I should really read Gibson, and that would give me an alternative approach. So it was during that time in the middle 1980s that I was doing all this stuff, reading.
And how would you left psychology out, just for people who don't know what was that? That was
Well,
trying to the environment and the sociality, and somehow you were missing
it's
the
because
psychology.
I've been sort of writing and teaching in this area of ecological anthropology, and the challenge there had been to try and connect what anthropology was saying about people and social relations with what biology was saying, above all, about evolution. The sort of biology that comes into anthropology is largely evolutionary, not developmental. So I was trying to find a bridge between those two, and I started from the premise that what we say in anthropology about people and their relationships must at least be compatible with what biologists are saying about human evolution. I thought humans have evolved. We know how they've evolved. It's not for us to question that. So at least what we're saying about social life must be compatible with what we know about human evolution. That was my premise at that time. So that was simply linking anthropology and biology. And part of my excuse was simply that was a big enough job in itself. I mean, just managing those two without having to cope with psychology as well. But then, obviously, that was a thing that was missing, and the problem then was to find the right kind of psychology, and that's where Gibson really did help. When I first read Gibson, I couldn't quite see it. I mean, I read it and I thought, not sure. But then it began to grow on me. I was reading von Uexküll as well. And then I think in 1992, I wrote a paper comparing Gibsonian and von Uexküllian approaches and what their implications would be for the anthropological understanding of culture. And I think that was the first article in anthropology, barring Hallowell, who was writing in the mid-1960s, that introduced Gibson into anthropology.
And you were already reading Bergson and Whitehead too, so you were already thinking in terms of process at that time?
Yes, yeah. I when I was writing this big book on evolution, and I was looking for a book, I don't know what book I was looking for. I was looking for a book in the evolution section of the shelf of the library in the John Rylands University Library at Manchester. I was looking for something, and as my eye was going along the shelf, I found this thing, said Creative Evolution by Henri Bergson. So I thought, what this is, and pulled it out, opened it up, noticed that nobody had taken it out of the library since around 1950, and it was so full of dust that I began to sneeze. And I thought, this is interesting. I took it home, I checked it out and took it home and opened it up, and was completely blown away. I mean, I said, this is everything I'm trying to say. So then Bergson became a kind of philosophical hero for me. But of course, he was deeply unfashionable at that time. And I remember a little sort of philosophy workshop that was held in Manchester. I was based there, and just a small group. I'd just been reading Bergson, and I was full of enthusiasm. I've just been reading this Bergson. It's looking at all these wonderful things, all these wonderful ideas. And my fellow philosophers went a bit white in their face and said, it's all very well for you as an anthropologist, but we have our careers to think about, and you just don't mention Bergson. And that was mid-1980s, so about 1985, 1986.
Yeah, now Bergson's coming back suddenly.
But Bergson is back, thanks to Deleuze.
And Deleuze, Whitehead, process.
And Whitehead is in fashion too. And I was reading Process and Reality. I was reading around the same time as I was writing this evolution book. That's much more difficult, but
I had a similar thing when I read Creative Evolution, but for you, what was it? You said it's everything you'd been trying to say. Was it, how would you, I know it's hard to put it into words, it's a whole book, but what do you think was the light bulb going off there when you read that?
the process philosophy, the idea that life is not something that is simply expended in the life cycle of an organism. I mean, in a Darwinian approach, an organism is born, lives its life, and that's it, end of story. The only thing that it passes on is what we would now call its genes. Of course, Darwin didn't know, but some factors of heredity. What Bergson showed was that life is a process that carries on through. And as he would put it, every organism is a thoroughfare. And that just spoke to me. I thought, that's it. That's it. That will give me I was stuck with an opposition well established in the literature between two approaches to evolution. One was the sort of adaptation model, which is multilinear, where things go off in all sorts of different directions depending on what the conditions of adaptation are. And the other was the standard Enlightenment progress view. And evolution is a one-way advance. And all the debates were between these two positions, reflected in different kinds of ways, but basically that's what it was. And the whole debate had got stuck between these alternatives. And Bergson offered a release from that. It offered a third way, which was founded on an understanding of life that the Darwinists regarded as simply mystical, fantastical nonsense, but actually was coherent. And I think that's what it was.
I wonder if you were learning, because a lot of this, people saying you can't read Bergson or you can't read this, or a lot of this is feeling like we always have to make some decision between this or this or this. And when I read Whitehead and Bergson and Bateson and a lot of these other people that inspire me and I think also inspire you, it seems like a practice more that allows you to hold different perspectives and understand that they might make sense in different situations rather than constantly sort of being this pendulum that has to go between. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but even in terms of the organism or the person, is that really a choice? Or did you start to think about the entire process a bit differently as a process, I guess, as something different?
I started thinking about it quite differently. So that although in the literature, psychology is often presented as a bridge between the biological and the social, with a sort of layer of mind in between. It's like the glue that holds the two sides together. I called that the complementarity thesis. It's the thesis that a human, and it goes back to Durkheim, the human being is one part organism, one part person. There's a biological bit and there's a social bit, and the bit that the glue that holds the two sides together is the mind, and that's the province of psychology. That was the let's call it the standard model. I called that the complementarity thesis, and I ended up with what I called it's a bad word, but I called it the obviation thesis, which meant I was getting rid of, eliminating this opposition, this idea of complementarity, by finding a way of showing how actually it's not that a human being is one part organism and one part person, but actually that organism and person are one and the same thing. And then I realized in order to do that, I'd need a different biology, a different ecology, a different psychology. And all of that work that I did in the 1990s was to try and put together a different synthesis, an alternative synthesis to the dominant neo-Darwinian sociobiological, cognitive psychological one, which would be, and I was looking for what the components of that synthesis would be, and it was not evolutionary but developmental biology, ecological psychology, the anthropological theory of practice, and a mixture of phenomenology and pragmatism in philosophy. Put those things together. And of course, an approach to language that is more Wittgensteinian than Chomskyan, let's say.
It seems from our position today that makes a lot more sense, but in part that's because you opened up ways for people to understand it, because I guess that's what I was trying to get at, is you almost had to redescribe the landscape in a sense, I did
have the feeling that, well, I had the feeling of having to start all over again, and I had these inspirational works that I read, Bergson, Gibson, Merleau-Ponty, those three particularly, that gave me something to build on. It was exciting. It really was.
Yeah.
You feel that that something was coming together there.
Yeah, I think it is exciting. There's a feeling of enthusiasm in the writing and in the way that it's presented. I wonder what it was like, though, because you did introduce Gibson into this world, and that's not an easy thing to introduce. And did it just come naturally for you in the same way as what you're describing when you just kind of go into working with the Sami and you're just doing it?
Well, it was a bit like fieldwork in a way. That what happened was that one of the big upcoming names in ecological psychology at the time, Ed Reed, wrote me a letter. Sometime he happened to have read something I published in an anthropological journal. It was an article called "The Architect and the Bee." It was published, I think, in 1983, and Ed happened to read this. And Ed was a great champion of Gibsonian ecological psychology. He sadly passed away very prematurely. But he wrote a letter to me and said that I really had to read Gibson. That Gibson would give me would get me out of some of the holes that I got into. So eventually, I did. And at first, like I mentioned, I wasn't quite sure how this would fit. And then it dawned on me that actually this work held the clue to the solution to a problem in which my own field of ecological anthropology had got stuck. And the problem was what to do about culture. Were we going to think of culture as something that mediates, gets in the middle between organisms and their environment, culture as a kind of means of adaptation? Or were we going to think of culture as the very world that people are adapting to? And we got the ecological anthropology got stuck in this, and it wasn't moving anywhere. And I realized that Gibson offered an alternative way to approach this issue because of his theory of direct perception. That is, that we can perceive the world in ways that are not mediated by anything. But trying to get this across, and still, even today, when I try to get this across to my anthropological colleagues, they think, oh, direct perception is just sort of magical idea that the world simply imprints itself on the perceiver. And I say, no, it's not that at all. But it was very difficult. And mostly, I mean, anthropology, there's been a sort of choice between Gibsonian ecological psychology or Peircean semiotics. And most anthropologists rather like semiotics, and they go that way rather than, some try to have it both ways. I don't think you can. I do think there's a choice between the two. But it's very hard to get my anthropological colleagues out of the way of thinking that all perception involves interpretation. And anyway, I mean, Gibson was a necessary stepping stone for me. I've now kind of moved beyond Gibson. There are lots of aspects of his work that I find problematic, but I wouldn't have got to where I've got to now without his help. So
yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to get at with the other writers too, is that there was a shift. It's almost as if you picked up the structure and shifted it a bit. So, but I don't know how to explain that exactly to people who don't know. So, for example, with the nature versus nurture or culture and nature, was there a way that these kinds of writings, the ecological perception or the process, was a way to look at that differently in that sense of?
I just thought that, I mean, anthropology had been stuck with these terms, nature and culture, for a long time, and particularly through structuralism and Levi-Strauss and all this stuff. And I wasn't the only one in the 1990s who was saying that perhaps we need to move beyond these terms, that they're not being terribly helpful. And I found the best way forward was to talk about environment and perception rather than nature and culture. And so hence the perception of the environment was I think that's the issue, not nature and culture. And we have to understand how this perception works. But I wasn't the only one. It soon became, I think maybe I was writing some of the first things about this in the early 1990s, but after a while, the nature culture dichotomy became one of these things that everybody wants to say, oh, this ridiculous nature culture dichotomy, nobody has it outside the West, blah blah blah, and it gets a bit tiresome after a while. You think, oh no, I've had enough of it, and now. I mean, strangely enough, I keep changing my mind about things, and now I actually think we need to have these words back. And I've been arguing that we really need to have a concept of nature, we need to have a concept of culture, but not in the way they were understood by modern thought. The point is that both nature and culture are very old words. And nature comes from Latin nascere, meaning to be born, culture from colere, meaning to cultivate. And I think we should go back to nature in its original sense that you find, for example, in Lucretius, De Rerum Naturae, a power distributed throughout the cosmos to give birth to new life. That's very Bergsonian.
Oh, yeah.
And culture, meaning the task, the human task of looking after this newborn life so that it can flourish. And in those senses, I think you could find equivalents of the words nature and culture in just about every indigenous group you would look at. They all have this idea that there's a potential at large in the world to give birth to life. And they all have this idea that human beings have a responsibility to look after it. And that's it. And we must have these words. And I think it's necessary to bring them back. So that's where I am now.
Yeah, it's like T.S. Eliot coming back to where you started, but knowing it for the first time, because they're not stuck in the way they were at the beginning, in the way that you're using them there. But it seems like you would have had to go through all of this.
I had to go through all of that to get
to that. Yeah.
Yes.
That reminds me, well, I want to talk about the way you think about anthropology, and that sort of goes towards it of not as some people might be thinking of it as just going and observing people, the way you talk about ethnography, for example, but maybe you want to help people understand the way you think about anthropology now. And I know you've written a whole many books about it, so I'm not expecting you to go into all that, but for someone who doesn't think about these terms, are you thinking of it as a way that we participate in building the future together or educating one another?
Yes, in a way. I think of it as a conversation. And if we think of every life lived as an experiment in living, if you think that what all of us are trying to do is to figure out how on earth to live in this world, and that's what our life is actually the process of trying to figure this out. Of course, we'll never find the answer, but this is also a collective thing that we're doing it together and learning from one another as we go. Then anthropology is that one discipline that is prepared to take these experiments seriously, wherever they're being carried out, by whomever, and to learn from them in this collective task of figuring out how should we live. I mean, that's an ethical question, and I think anthropology is a fundamentally ethical discipline in that sense. It's a discipline that addresses the question, how should we live in this world? And it does so by listening to and learning from all the millions of experiments that people have made around the world throughout time, and say, what can we learn from these? Not what we learn about them, but what we can learn from them. So that means that, and of course, in a way, that's a philosophical problem. And my argument always is that anthropology can do better philosophy than the philosophers do, because rather than simply engaging with literary works in the philosophical canon from Aristotle onwards, you're actually engaging with real lives as they're lived. I think that means that we can do much better philosophy. And the key characteristics of that philosophy are four things. One is generosity, which means we actually listen to what people are telling us, rather than treating them as data to be analyzed or case studies. That it is comparative, which means that whenever we look at one way of doing things. We realize that there are other ways of doing them. It's open-ended in that it doesn't aim for final solutions, but for ways to keep going. And it's critical in the sense that we can never be content with things as they are. And those four qualities are what, to my mind, make up the anthropological conversation. And it's only different from ethnography because ethnography has different objectives. The objective of an ethnographer is to study and get to understand and write sensitively about how people are experiencing their life as it is lived, whoever they are and wherever it is. And that's a different objective from the objective of asking questions about what the possible conditions and possibilities of life might be. And I think in anthropology, because we've tended to muddle these two things up, that's one reason why anthropology has not had the kind of public impact that I think it should have. And that's the reason why I think we need to really have a public impact. We in anthropology have to be very, very clear about what we do and why it matters. And I think that confounding anthropological and ethnographic objectives has made it more difficult rather than less to explain that.
Thank you. That's very well said. How do you see the relationship of subject and object there, though, as being different? I'm trying to relate it too to what we were talking about with the immediacy and this sense that we're moving past the idea that there's this and then we bridge it, and instead that there's something participatory and coupling and processual that's always going on. So as the role of the anthropologist, how does that relate?
To get beyond, like many others, I want to get beyond the division between subject and object. And the way to do that is to focus on the verb. And I find this happening over and over again. I get stuck in a subject-object thing. The way to get unstuck is to say, right, let's go for the verb in the middle. And let's bring the subject and the object into the verb. We're a bit stuck working in English or other standard European languages in that we have this subject-verb-object grammatical structure, but lots of ergative languages, such as many Amerindian languages, what we would call the subject and the object are enveloped within the verb. So that if you said the boy kicked the ball, no, both the boy and the ball will be inside the verb of kicking. And the boy is not, it exists only in the subject and the object exist only in the process of what they're doing. So the boy is the boy's kicking. It's not as though there's a boy and the boy kicks. The boy is present in the world because there's kicking going on, and it's like that. So I found a great inspiration in what linguists call the middle voice of the verb, which apparently, for reasons I don't understand, disappeared from most English usage and in other European languages sometime between the ancient Greeks and now, because the ancient Greeks had it, but we don't. And the middle voice is achieving something that is achieved in you, in the middle voice of the verb. And the closest to it is something like, I fell asleep, or I fell in love, or something like that, where it's something that happens to you, you're inside it, but it's not passive, it's active. So that's the middle voice of the verb. And I think that sort of, that just that little thing solves a lot of puzzles for me.
Yes, a lot of your writing, humaning, you talk about humifying or humaning and wayfaring, and there's a part in one of your books where you're talking about weaving and making, and I think that maybe I'll get this upside down, but that the making is the modality of the weaving rather than the other way around. Have these been ways that have helped you express this different approach that we've been trying to talk about here that's quite hard to talk about, but by exploring these ways of talking about art or being or architecture or whatever the subject may be, has that been what's helped you to do this?
has. It definitely has. Saying that you can get through that simply by doing something, particularly in a teaching situation. If I'm working with students and we do something like make a basket together, and then you can start having a discussion about, well, what were we doing actually? What's going on in this activity that we call making? And are you in, what does it mean to be inside that activity? It's very hard to discuss these sorts of questions sort of up in the air. But if you're actually in the middle of making a basket, then people say, oh, it's obvious, isn't it? Here I am making this basket. What's going on? Well, I'm weaving these sticks. And it all becomes very, very clear.
It seems there's a continuity. When we try to talk about these things or put them into categories and disciplines, we seem to lose the continuity, which reminds me a bit of what you said at the beginning about after you'd put everything into the book, you seem to have lost the essence of it. And I feel like with your writing, and you actually do it in the writing, it's almost as if the writing feels like a practice. And then therefore, when someone is reading it, they can experience it so that it's more alive and there's a continuity. Do you think of it in that way?
Yeah. I like to think that when I'm writing, it's like writing a letter. When you're writing a letter, you're writing to somebody, talking about whatever you're talking about, but you're addressing this person as though you imagine that the reader is there with you, but because you're writing it, they're somewhere else. But it's as if you were having a conversation and the reader was right there, and you're holding them by the hand and say, come along and let me show you things. And so without being sort of paternalistic or sort of imagine one's talking down to people, I'm not talking down to people, but there is a sense of companionship. And
this word correspondence comes up, and also transducing, and there's something happening there.
Well, correspondence is in there, because I was thinking of correspondence in the sense that we used to use when we'd simply be sending letters to one another. You would send a letter to me, I'd send a letter to you, and we'd go backwards and forwards, and that's an ongoing conversation. And I think of writing like that rather than the typical academic text where the author stands on a pedestal and proclaims that because I'm an academic and I've studied these things, I know how it is, and here I'm telling you. And I'll tell you, because you're a bit stupid, I'll tell it in a sort of simplified language so that your little brain will understand. And that, if you want, that's the very opposite. That's the kind of writing I can't stand, and I want to try and do it differently.
Yeah, and you do it differently. I think your writing is very beautiful, and I wonder if it just came naturally for you at some point. Once it seems like it must be connected to the different realizations you had about all the things we've been talking about in terms of process, because there's a kind of flow to it.
Yeah, it is a craft, but like any craft, it's incredibly difficult. It's really, really hard. People think, oh, that must have been easy to write. It reads so well, or something, and you say it only reads well because an enormous amount of effort goes into it. So I'm finding writing every year it becomes more and more difficult. It's really hard work.
Yeah, the easier it is to read, often the harder it was to write, which is very strange.
It's really hard work, and you have to put an awful lot of thought into it. And whenever I'm really getting stuck, it usually means that there's something, a kind of glitch in whatever it is that I haven't properly thought out yet. And you have to go back, think it out properly, and then it resolves itself.
Have you found walking helpful?
Yes, I'm not big grand walks. I just do a half-hour walk before breakfast every day. It's the same walk every day. I got into that habit a few years ago, and it just clears my head. Usually the day before I've been working on something, whatever it is, and you can go so far and then you get stuck and things are going nowhere. So you get on with something else, sleep on it, wake up the next morning, and go for a walk, and the sentences begin to flow again. So you get home, get that down, and that gives you a springboard for the next day. So that's necessary. And there's something, I mean, many people, I don't know how many, over and over again, people have remarked on the fact that walking helps to loosen up one's thinking and get.
Yeah, what connects to this movement and this process and
It's
this
something to do with the movement.
verb.
It's very well attested.
And also changing your place, does that help? Because I feel like in a few of the books you went to this place in, was it Finland?
Yeah, but that's a place. But that's a place that I know intimately, and I can only really write if I'm so completely at home in a place that I'm not having to place where I'm not having to waste mental energy trying to sort out where I am and what I'm supposed to do. So if in a place where you can just feel entirely comfortable, then I can write. But I'm not much good at writing if I'm traveling somewhere or conference or some hotel or something like that. It's not so good.
You have to put your attention on it.
Yes, yeah. So if I'm, so I either write here in this study that you can see, where I'm surrounded by my stuff, my books,
wonderful, yeah.
Or in this place in Finland, which we've been going to for over 30 years now.
So we haven't talked about the lineology and this. We're talking about place now, but you often talk about life happening in the lines. How would you introduce that to someone who's never really thought about it before? Are you still the only lineologist in the world, or are there many now?
I maybe not. Other people are picking it up, but maybe not calling themselves lineologists, and that's perhaps just as well. I don't really think the idea of linealogy was sort of a joke, but to explain to people, I would simply start with the question that I think I start the book on lines with. You know, what does now I can't remember them all. What does walking, singing, drawing, storytelling, weaving,
writing,
and so forth, they all have in common? Well, they all take place along lines of one sort and another. And as soon as you explain that to people, they say, I suppose that's the case. And then after a while, they start coming up with things I'd never have thought of. Had you ever thought about this? They say. I thought, oh, no. So it was like hitting on a gold seam. You know, if you're a goldsmith perfecter and you suddenly hit on a seam, and I'd struck gold with this lines thing because it just seemed to be inexhaustible. And so I'm still reaping the benefits of that.
Do you remember how that came about? Because I also find that there's two things. I mean, it's an easy way to understand all these things we've been talking about without having to say them directly. So that bridge that doesn't need to be a bridge, you can sort of flow between these, what once seemed like separate categories that couldn't be put together. And you can also have that feeling of immediacy, even if you try to explain it, people might say they don't agree with it, but it's in that. So do you remember when that came to you? I know you thought it was your own idea, and then you kind of realized maybe others had similar ideas, but no one had really written about it in this exact way before. So do you remember when that was that an epiphany, or it just came slowly over time?
Sort of came slowly over time. So the immediate stimulus for it was that I'd been working with a Japanese PhD student who came back from the field having studied folk music, studied flute playing in the traditional Japanese flute, came back with musical notation of a kind that I'd never seen before. And we started working on that and finding some parallels between this notation and the sort that was used in Gregorian chant in medieval times. And it got me thinking about how we make the distinction between writing and musical notation. And I realized that you couldn't have a history of writing that wasn't a history of musical notation as well. And that all had to do with the particular way in which in Europe we distinguish between speech and song, which is not the way it's done in Japan. And this was a matter of trying to understand this writing notation. They're all done in lines. And so it all started from there, in a way, that particular question. But it took root, I think, because I think there are three things. One is going back to my dad and the mycology. In fungi are very linear in that way. The fungal mycelium is a mesh of lines. So that's one thing. The second thing is, again, my experience of doing fieldwork with Sami people, where one of the most remarkable things is that everybody has their own footpath. It's a footpath connecting their winter dwelling to their summer place where they fish. So everybody has their own particular footpath. The people may use it, but they'll recognize it as so-and-so's footpath, and there are all sorts of signs that indicate that they've been going up and down for a while. And so it's fairly well established in Sami thinking that people are their paths, people are their footpaths. And when you yoik a person, you travel their path. I mean, it's very sort of obvious in a way. And then the third thing was playing the cello, which has affected, I think, the way I think and the way I write in all sorts of ways. And I've been playing the cello since I was 12. So I think these three things together have had something to do with it.
And what is it about the cello? Because that does seem a big inspiration in the background. Is it the practice?
It's a very gestural instrument. I mean, you learn a piece of music gesturally rather than as a sequence of notes. And you have the feeling when you play that you're pulling this line out of the instrument. It's like it's pulling treacle out of a jar. You sort of drag it out, and that's just the way it is. And it's the instrument is of one's own. Well, it's a bit smaller than a human body, but it's sort of comparable size, and it makes it a very special kind of instrument in that way. And the funny thing is that when I get into correspondence with people who maybe through email or whatever, and you get the feeling that they really get it, sort of intuitively. It always turns out later on in the correspondence that they're cello players as well. So there's something about
wow,
that does a certain sensibility that all cello players seem to have. It's very different from it being a violinist or something.
I don't know how to make the connection, but is there a connection there in terms of the embodiment and the...
Well, there is. I'm a bit tired, although I've used it a lot, and now I wish I hadn't. I'm a bit fed up with the concept of embodiment.
Why is that? Because everybody's using it now, or?
No, it's a very specific reason, and the same reason why I'm a bit fed up with agency. The thing is that it's obvious, for example, that playing a cello is a bodily activity. That's obvious, goes without saying. But to say that it's embodied is another matter altogether. And what I'm bothered about is the extent to which people confuse bodily with embodied. And the thing is that the M of embodiment implies a sort of wrapping up, a sinking. It's as though the body was a sink and the skill sinks into it. And I think that's wrong. I mean, for example, if you said that breathing was embodied, you would suffocate. So I think and I'm not alone in this. Philosophers have said the same thing, particularly Maxine Sheets Johnson, who's a philosopher of dance, and she hates the concept of embodiment and says we should use the words like animate instead. So pointing to the liveliness of the activity. So the problem is just with the M bit, the front of embodied.
No, I can see that. I can see what you mean. It does sound like it's closed, which is.
And then you find some writers actually falling into the trap of thinking that's how it actually is. Particularly in sociology, lots of sociologists who write about embodied skill as though it was close to automatism, something that's simply sedimented into the body, like changing the gear on your car or brushing your teeth. So it's embodied in the sense that you don't even think about it. It just it just does it, and that doesn't work if you're talking about playing a musical instrument or climbing a rock face or doing some of these things that requires intense concentration.
Yeah, I think if you're coming at it from neuroscience or from a certain field that's studying mind, then it can feel like a revelation to go into the body and use that term. But if you're coming at it from playing cello or walking, it seems almost, it's almost doing the opposite.
I've had some arguments with the new cognitive science, the 4 E's people with their embodiment and extension and embeddedness and whatever the fourth one is, and I don't really go with that. It's still
what is it about that bothers you? It's just the
I think
categorization of all that stuff in the same way.
I think there's still it's still too cognitive for me. It's still treating the thinker, the doer, as engaged in exercises of problem solving, coming up with solutions that are then enacted in the world. So that's in activism, in
embedded
Andy Clark's kind of extended mind theory. I think again, it's come to double-edged because the thinker is supposed to be enrolling aspects of the world to help in their thinking, to solve problems which they will then enact in the world. So it portrays the mind as a kind of double agent.
But you would still agree with the sort of Bateson origins of that, of the walking stick or whatever as being.
Yes. But I would go in a more phenomenological direction, I think. So I'm not myself satisfied with. I know that cognitive science is not what it used to be, and it's getting somewhere.
Well, how do you see it all, Tim? Do you think of thinking and all the stuff we mean by cognition, which a lot of people mean different things by that term, but do you think of it as continuous with moving? I mean, is wayfaring also mind in process? I mean, at some point, I think you might even say that, but you say it's the fundamental mode, right, of our being. So
pretty much, I think. Yeah. Sometimes it seems to me that everything's fine as long as people simply talk about thinking or think about thinking, but something goes wrong as soon as this word cognition comes in. It's a very hard
why
word.
is that?
No, it's a. I mean, I find that it's a word if I can help it, I just don't want to use, and it's partly, like I think you mentioned, this opposition between cognition and locomotion doesn't really make sense in terms of the way I think about it, and yet I think when scholars resort to the idea of cognition, even if they don't explicitly oppose it to locomotion, that opposition is still there at the back of between the lines, so to speak, or the back of their minds. It's just the idea that you can separate out cognition per se as something you're trying to study, as distinct from other things. And I don't.
Is that similar to saying you could study just a person or just an organism? I mean, because some of it, sometimes you flip, the way idea and movement might be used. And there's some part of me that thinks that's what we have to do with this word cognition, that we have to understand it the other way around. It's much more radical, that what we think of as cognition is the tip of what begins with, any movement, walking or learning how to walk or anything like that.
Thinking a lot about attention, and and thinking that this is actually a lot of what we're calling thinking or even cognition is actually about attention, and attention is a kind of skilled perception, um, and um, and so I think probably want to say that if we're going to talk about cognition, let's put it inside, bracket it inside attention, rather than treat attention as the subsidiary thing. I mean, in classical writings, attention tends to get sort of second place, given second place. You think, you do your cognition, and then you have to attend to things. But I think I would put it the other way around. Start with attention, modes of attention, because then you're always attending to something. The world is already there in what you're doing. You don't have to establish some sort of contact with it. So you've done all this cognition, and now you need to connect up with the world. With attention, the world is already there right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, to me, I mean, it makes me think of more recent ideas. For example, instead of these layers that you talk about when we're talking more about the way we think of generations and the future, that you say we often think about layers. And again, there's that kind of separate thing being put on top of another separate thing and starting over, beginnings and ends. And you talk about it more like a rope, or I might even think of it like the way you've been describing the mycelium. And if we really understood these ideas, we wouldn't be able to separate cognition from all these other movements and processes, would we? I mean, they would be part
not
of.
really. I mean, you then face the criticism that I sometimes got, which is sometimes called conflationism, which is you can't separate anything from anything else. Everything's entangled, and a lot of my scientist friends, people from cognitive psychology or those sorts of areas, say, of course we agree with everything you say, but we can't proceed on that basis. I mean, we know everything's entangled with everything else, and you say everything's entangled with everything else, but if we're going to do our science, they say, if we're going to find anything out, well, we just have to make some cuts somewhere and say, look, I'm going to deal with this and that.
Yeah, I think that's a trap. And I think your work is trying to show a way out of that trap, because then we just keep swinging those pendulums again, like what we were talking about at the beginning, rather than, I mean, you say somewhere art and technology, or I'm not sure what words you use, but you say that they're only words. And so are nature and culture. And those are important words, and they refer to important things in context. But can we get to a point where we have enough nuance to understand that we're talking about those things as words in context, and at the same time, everything is connected in a process, and like why do we have to choose between those? Why do we have to choose between those two things that you just laid out?
It's just a matter of priorities. So with the building dwelling thing, or the making weaving, it's not that it's all one thing or rather than the other, or that one is denying that if you put dwelling before building, isn't to say that people don't build things, but simply that the building is inside the dwelling rather than the other way around. It's just a matter of giving some things ontological priority, and usually it turns out to be priority of process over outcome. So with dwelling and building, and dwelling is a process term, building is an outcome term, and I've found that mostly that's what I've been wanting to do, is to get the process in first.
Well, I think these have very big consequences, or I'm not sure what the word is, but it's very meaningful. For example, when you were talking about the baskets that you made with your class, when I was reading that part in the book, I wonder, what's happening in those moments when you're teaching, because you're teaching, you're learning. Where I feel like this is very meaningful, and it has to do with that question of how should we live. And I know it's very hard to talk about, but after all these years of teaching and writing, and what's been the place that you've been able to notice that meaning? Because all of this really does matter in the way we talk about it and the way we think of it. But I wonder how you've been able to get a grasp on that for yourself, or what parts have sort of stood out over time or recurred in terms of understanding why this is meaningful, or the motivation, I guess, for you.
Well, one thing is that I've realized that that teaching or education more generally is not a byproduct of what we do in our disciplines. It's essential to them. So that if I'm supposed to be teaching anthropology to students, it's not as though anthropology is this separate thing and I'm simply, we got anthropology anyway, and then I'm simply conveying the content of anthropological knowledge to students. Actually, the teaching is an essential part of doing anthropology. It's not an add-on to a process of research that's done somewhere else with other people. And that's something that I've found very insistent on, because I think that then anthropology actually opens up an alternative way of understanding what education is, which has been rather fundamental. But that's on a general philosophical level. I mean, on a practical level, if you're out with students making baskets or doing some other thing like that, most of the time you're preoccupied with a practical question and just keeping the whole thing going. I mean, you've got a whole lot of students to look after who are getting stuck with one thing and another, and you've got to make sure that they start on time and end on time, and everybody goes home happy. And
well, I mean, you laugh, and that's great, but that's actually very connected to your work, I think, and to these bigger themes of, if we really took that seriously, if we really took education in that way, rather than these disciplines that we do in order to get a job and so on. And also just what you described in the class. I mean, that's a task and a responsibility. And I think you've talked about how life can be approached in that way. And that doesn't feel like the way we're really learning how to do it right now.
No,
I don't know.
It doesn't. And it's all a bit distressing right now. I don't know quite what to do. And I mean, that everything just seems to be going in completely the wrong direction. Everybody is shouting about that it is in the wrong direction and hoping that, but nobody seems to be able to turn it around. And I don't know quite how we're going to manage this. I'm a bit of a technophobe, and I don't think that digital technology is the future. I don't think it's going to last more than another century at most. And I think, therefore, we have to take care of the skills that humans have found useful for even tens of thousands of years, and make sure that they're there for generations to come. And it seems to me sort of fairly obvious, but to try and get that across to people is really hard, and just seems to get harder by the day.
Well, there's something very rich and important in what you just said. So, but you think that we won't have technology? You think there'll be some sort of crash or something, and we have to?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll have. I mean, we'll have some sort of. We'll obviously have tools, instruments that we can use, but the digital technology that we have now, and if it's going to expand the way the prophets of AI hope and expect, the demands it will place on the environment are wildly unsustainable. I mean, we're already now reading about rare earths, these odd minerals that are used in every mobile phone and every device and every missile system and all these. That the reason why they're rare is not because they're actually uncommon, but because actually extracting them is so difficult that it causes enormous environmental impacts. That can't go on. I mean, either we'll destroy the world, or they'll. I don't know. I mean, I know that I'm going to die, but I don't know when or how. And I think it's the same about digital technology. It's not going to last. I don't know how it will end, whether in a big crash or gradually. But I think to presume that somehow it's going to magically self-sustain itself forever is completely absurd. But that seems to be what most people think at the moment.
I think most people don't understand that every little thing takes a lot of resources. We haven't really made the connection yet. It feels all like it's for free. There's a kind of awakening that's going to have to come there and so on. But I think this relates a lot to your work and this wayfaring or the lineology, moving, the lines of our life. We all have a line that we've been on since we were born, moving, and we can't get off it. It is us. And that connection to the kinetics and the movement, and that being what is the knowledge that's carried on. That's what I read in your work. Like, that's what we're carrying on. And if we look right now at how are we moving, what are the fundamental modes of our wayfaring, of our movement? When I try to connect that to the point you just made, it seems like there's something very important there that we could realize relative to how we want to live and what kind of future we really want to have.
I've been very inspired recently by Hannah Arendt's writing about education in particular, because that's what I've just been working on, and where she says that it's the responsibility of grown-ups, people like us, to introduce new people into a world that we love. New people being children, of course. There's new people arrive, and it's our job to introduce them to a world that we know and a world that we love. Because only if we do that, those new people have the chance to renew that world for generations to come. If we tell our young people that actually this world is complete crap, it's been rubbish, but now we have a wonderful, shiny new design that which you have to be inducted into, he says that's not education, that's indoctrination, that's propaganda, and that's mostly what it is at the moment. And so I'm very taken by this idea that what is fundamental is what Arendt called amor mundi, love for the world, and that's what we have to regain somehow. We've lost it.
Or we don't notice it, or we don't realize it's actually what we're looking for, or that idea. I remember you writing about it or saying that we have to. Do we love the world enough to take responsibility for it? But connecting that with love, it actually gives life meaning, doesn't it? It makes.
Yes, I mean it's not a romantic, it's not a sentimental love. It's in Arendt's writing, it's rather austere, actually, kind of love. But what she means by it is a recognition that this world is there, that it's before us, and our job is to respect its presence and engage with it. It might not all be beautiful, it might not all be good, but it's there. And we then have to honor it in some sense. And honoring it means respecting it for what it is and engaging it with it on its terms and not on ours. And that's what I think we have tended to lose. And the reasons for that, I suppose, like most things, lie in capitalism and consumerism and this whole idea that the world is there in order to satisfy whatever needs or wants or desires we have just now. That's the opposite of respecting and loving the world or honoring the world for what it is. So I think that's probably, well, it's a complicated question, but probably that's what lies behind much of it.
Yeah, you talked about attention before, and it's part of your writing too. And a lot of people write today about how our attention has been taken, or we're not choosing where we put our attention on. Maybe we're getting distracted, or there's something in it's almost an act of kind of rebellion to actually put your attention on what's happening and
I
look
think there's an
yeah.
epidemic of thoughtlessness at the moment,
Mm.
and the opposite is being thoughtful, and but being thoughtful is being attentive, and it's going to be it's slightly different from talking about cognition. Thoughtfulness is not just kind of working things out or solving a problem. It's a kind of attention and responsiveness, and the argument I would make, and that Arendt makes as well, is that you can't have responsibility without responsiveness, and you can't have responsiveness without attention. You can't have attention without that attention having been educated through the work of others as you grow up. So those are all connected.
Do you think it connects to the feeling your father might have had, right, with his work and trying to walk with you and teach you about it, or even
I think
the
so.
Sami people and the reindeer? I mean, I feel like there's something in there that we all want, that.
I think so, and it's what indigenous people. It's a horrible word, indigenous people, and it sounds like a terrible generalization. But if you just bear with that for a moment, it's what they're telling us all the time. They talk about, not a cynical way, not in a glib way. They talk about the their ancestors and their elders. They talk about the wisdom of their ancestors and their elders, and they say it's this wisdom that they're trying to learn and to follow. And they would say that we are trying to follow in the footsteps of our elders, and we are trying to keep the continuity of tradition on the grounds not that we're stuck in the past and the tradition is some sort of exercising nostalgia, but that tradition actually holds the promise of the future. And so I do think that we need to turn around and face in the direction of what some would call the past, but is actually the future, because they're the people who've gone before us and laid down paths for us to follow. The trouble with the kind of digital world we're inheriting now is that it leaves no paths for anybody to follow. It produces a generation, as another colleague has said, called it a generation of orphans, people who don't know the love of the world that their parents should have inducted them into. And so that's, I think, where we have somehow to turn things around on that. How we do it, I don't know.
Maybe just by talking about it and by...
But there will be a start, and maybe by designing our living spaces, our cities, so that people of all generations can live together, and by changing our ways of education. And there's so much to change.
I don't think people are happy with this way of
No.
being. I think it's that people don't know that they're missing that line or that lineage that you just described. People want that. It's just how to reconnect and turn our attention back towards that. I do think people want it if they understood it as an alternative.
Okay. So I think that then our job, or my job anyway, is to try and articulate what that alternative is. At least I think that's what I think I'm doing, and I think that's what anthropology is there to do.
I do. I think that's what when you talk about how should we live, and you write about that, and it does end up being an expression of this. I think if people can feel that, even if it's hard to put in exact words, but you can feel it in the writing, you want more of it, right? There's a line, right? A lineage that everyone is part of, but if they don't attend to it and know they're part of it, they don't feel it. So how does one become aware of that?
It's resonating, yes. So there's hope. There's always hope.
There's always hope. I'm sure that it is going to continue and reverberate.
I hope so. Okay, well, I'll say goodbye. Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.